Well, good evening, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started and kick off our budget town hall. Can everyone hear me okay? Is it too loud or right? It's okay. So I'm Mary Ann Dewan, and I'm the County Superintendent of Schools for Santa Clara County Office of Education. And I'd like to welcome you to, I think, the first ever in the history of the County Office of Education budget town hall meeting. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. The restrooms are located right outside this door in the lobby area. In the event of an emergency, one of our staff members will pick up the clipboard that's hanging over here on the wall next to the phone. And then we'll ask everyone to exit either this door or that door, and we'll congregate out in the parking lot. Hopefully there are no emergencies this evening. And to get us started, I wanted to show a little video that highlights some of the programs of our County Office of Education. So the County Office of Education, for those of you who are community members and perhaps not as familiar with our office, provides a wide range of services and supports. We're organized into different branches of responsibility, and we're led by the County Board of Education, an elected body. This past week, on Tuesday evening, our board took action to fill vacancy in trustee area 2, and they elected Kathleen King. So trustee King is our new representative to the Board of Education. We also have trustee Green, trustee Ma, trustee Kamei, DeSalvo, Song, and Rossi. And I believe that trustee King will be joining us at some point this evening. So if she does arrive, I will take a moment to step outside our agenda and introduce her to the group. Joining me this evening also is our cabinet. And you know, I can't do any of the work of the office alone, and I rely heavily on the members of cabinet. Unfortunately, one of our cabinet members is not able to be here this evening, but I do want to go ahead and do introductions. So first, David Wu, our Chief Technology Officer. Please welcome. And Philip Gordillo, our Chief Human Resources Officer. And in our Chief for Academic Office, our branch, Dr. Jeanette Rodriguez-Chen. And our Chief Business Officer, Megan Riley. And our Chief of Public Affairs, Peter Daniels. And the unnamed individual is Chief Olmos, Steve Olmos, who is in charge of our Student Services branch. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to engage with our stakeholders and to gather some information to help us as we go through our budget development process. We're going to share a little bit about some of our County Office of Education services, provide a little bit of an overview of how the county office is funded and why we need to have this type of conversation at this time. We'll share a little bit about our organizational priorities and take some time to hear from our stakeholders. As we're working on our budget development this year, we're really using our strategic plan to help guide our conversations. We want to make sure that we organize our budget decisions and our budget overall to be aligned with our mission, our vision, and our values. There are many different approaches that you can take to budget development. One is you can look at individual programs, individual departments, and try to look for balancing within those. And another approach is to look at our organization overall. What are our priorities, and how do we align our investment to ensure that we're able to provide high-quality programs and services that support those priorities and help us accomplish our goals. So tonight, as you're engaged in conversation, I want you to also keep in mind our vision, which is to transform public education through leadership, service, and advocacy. We have 4 organizational goals. The first one is focused on closing the achievement gap and improving student equity and access to high-quality education. And we think about education for us as prenatal to age 24. Also to provide support to districts, communities, schools, and students. Within goal number 2, we have a strong emphasis on our partnerships with community and our obligations and mandates under state law to serve our school districts. Goal 3, to be a premier employer. And goal 4, around organizational effectiveness and efficiency. And again, this evening, as we're engaging with you, we're going to find a need to emphasize a little bit on goal 4, because often within improvements of organizational structure or organizational efficiencies, we also find cost savings. We can find ways that allow us to prioritize our dollars. I mentioned earlier that a key priority is to organize our budget decisions to ensure there's alignment to our values. This is really the most important part of our budget development conversation. We want to make sure that as we make a decision, that it supports our ability to implement our core values. Core value number 1 is students first. We want to be able to offer high-quality programs and services that ensure student success. Our second value is collaboration. Our third is innovation. And then lastly, service. So again, as we're organizing our decisions, we want to ensure that whatever we do, we're still able to provide high-quality services and do it in a way that our clients feel that we're exceeding their expectations. These values are aspirational. We try to live these values every day in our work, but we know that we're always striving to embed the values in our decision-making and in the work we do every day. We're going to have this budget conversation and engage with you in a climate of California's public school funding. And I want to point out some of the statistics that make it so critical that we understand some of our dilemma. So in California, even with the shift to the local control funding formula, we still rank 45th nationally in the percentage of taxable income that's spent on education. We're 41st in per pupil funding. Keep in mind that we live in Silicon Valley, one of the wealthiest communities in the world. And we live in California, which is one of the 6th largest economies in the world, certainly in the top 10. And yet, we're 45th in pupil to teacher ratios, 48th when you think about all staff to pupil ratios. And remember, we only have 50 states. And we trail the average of the top 10 states by almost $7,000 in per pupil funding. So the climate in which we're trying to make these decisions is pretty dramatic. As the County Office of Education, we recognize as well that we're having this conversation at the same time that a number of our districts are experiencing declining enrollment. They're engaging in layoffs and school closures and other challenges. And what we do, the decisions we make about what we charge for services, the programs we offer, impact them as well. So ultimately, districts could be doubly harmed by the decisions that the state makes in terms of funding and the decisions the county office makes and how we operate our programs and services. As I mentioned, a number of our districts are experiencing declining enrollment. That also impacts part of our budget calculation because part of how we're funded is based on the enrollment of students throughout the entire county. There are also rising costs and benefits and pensions, as most of you have likely heard about the dramatic increases to budget and also to employees for STRS and PERS contributions. And even at the full funding of the local control funding formula, which we anticipate we will be this year with Governor's proposal, we will just be reaching the 2007 levels of investment of state dollars in education. So although this sounds really dire, and for us it is certainly top of mind, we have a different vision of how we want to approach our budget development conversation. We're not looking at our programs and services from the lens of trying to make cuts or look for encroachment or trying to find the low levels and easy cuts that maybe will cause us to change the way we do business in ways that we don't desire or we're not designing. We really want to do this from the lens of our values, aligning to our priorities that allow us to leave a legacy of high quality service, and that as we think about closing the achievement and access gaps, that we're really going to make a difference and those public dollars would be used wisely. A couple of areas that you may not get to in your group discussion that I want to add about vision. One is that we are preparing to embark on a county-wide conversation about the continuum of services for special education students in our county, as well as within the state, and trying to align our vision to the statewide task force on special education that was completed about 2 years ago, that looked at a one system of education and trying to break down the silos and segregation of students with disabilities in our communities. We also want to portray an office that's organized in a way that people would say we're well-oiled, we're highly reliable, we're credible and trusted. And that people understand and see that advocacy is part of our work. Advocacy on behalf of all students, but especially those who are underrepresented, including, as we're talking about our conversations tonight, that a lot of our emphasis may need to be on our student-serving programs where we recognize we're also experiencing declining enrollment. And we want to have conversations about the organizational structure and a budget that's aligned to accomplish the goals of our office and allows us to build relationships, not tear them down. There are a few initiatives and priorities that have been identified by our County Board of Education that also resonate with our office that need to be mentioned for awareness. One is our Data Zone and Data Governance Initiative in partnership with the Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust. We know that's a #1 priority of our County Board of Education, a priority of the Superintendent's Office, and really supports our efforts to close the achievement gap and to be able to have data-driven conversations about student achievement. Secondly, our Strong Start and early learning advocacy is a #1 priority of our County Board of Education. And then thirdly, related to Strong Start, expansion of early education programs and services and supporting our school districts as they look to make increases of investment in early care and education. There are many other priorities, but those are just a few that we felt were important to raise awareness about this evening. So the vision for our budget conversations reflects these two statements, these two commitments. First, a budget that reflects our commitment to provide high-quality programs and is aligned to those 4 values I shared earlier. And secondly, a budget that supports an organizational structure that's designed to get results, allows us to accomplish our goals, and is aligned to our values. We want to be able to get the right things done, and we want to do them well. We want to be able to accomplish our goals and not have to say no to our stakeholders. We want to be known as the service organization that we were designed to be, and we want to allow our work to reflect our organizational values. We're funded with public money. It's public investment, and we're accountable to our public. As I mentioned earlier, I would take a break when our new trustee arrived, and she has arrived, so I'm going to take the moment to introduce Trustee Kathleen King, representing Area 2. Welcome. That's a good learning before your first meeting next week. So based on these commitments, I want to provide just an overview of the county office budget and our funding model. So back in 2012-13, the state revealed the local control funding formula, and we began implementation in the 13-14 school year. By the second year of LCFF, county offices of education already reached full funding. So as I mentioned earlier, our school districts are just now going to be at 100% full funding under the local control funding model. But we have been there since the second year. The model was designed to simplify funding calculations, so they eliminated lots of programs that we used to call categoricals. So a lot of the services that our county office provided used to be separately funded with state money under a specialized program or program name. All of that funding went away in that funding model transition. And so we made some choices at that time. We continued some of the programs, and some we did stop doing. There are two ways that the local control funding formula calculation can occur. The first one is called the target entitlement, and the second one is called the transition calculation. Our county office is funded on the transition calculation. It also happens to be the highest amount. If we were funded on the target entitlement, we would actually have less money in our budget. But the transition calculation gives us more funding. And because our county office is in an area where property taxes are high, property tax revenue is continuing to increase every year, our full entitlement is covered by property tax. Some places refer to that as basic aid. The parts of the calculation include the county revenue limit, what it used to be called in the old model. That was flat funded and is held constant in our current budget calculation. We receive a rate per ADA. That rate is also held constant. The ADA changes based on enrollment in our county. We receive ADA also for enrollment in our alternative education programs. We receive a flat amount held constant based on the amount of categorical funding we received at the time we transitioned to the local control funding formula. Interestingly, Santa Clara County is one of the lowest counties in the state in terms of that dollar amount. Many other county offices had a much larger categorical dollar amount, and they've been able to keep that amount. It's still held constant, held harmless, but it was much larger. For us, it's about $5 million. We also receive a local revenue calculation held constant, and then because we're funded on the transition calculation, we actually do not receive COLA. So in addition to that transition calculation, we also receive some federal funds for special programs. We receive some grants, and we have the ability to charge fees for some programs and services, and occasionally there's other revenue. But what we know about our county office budget, as is true for all county offices throughout the state, our revenue will remain flat. County offices are fully funded, and we do not anticipate any change in the formula. There's nothing in the education code or any of the calculations that will adjust the funding formula for county offices for 30 years into the future. So our revenue is flat. Just a couple things to show in terms of our budget. We do show different funds. So you can see we have the general fund, or what we call the County School Services Fund. We have some special revenue, which is our special education program. It's passed through, comes to the county office, but it supports school districts, and it's also used for the services that our office provides to districts. We have a child development fund for early learning, a special revenue cafeteria fund, and debt service, and then also our self-insurance fund. So not a lot of variability and not a lot of options that you can see. And then this is a list of some of the different funds that are part of the County School Services Fund. And so you can see the names of a number of our programs are there, Migrant Education, for example, Technology, Opportunity Youth Academy, et cetera. And then just as another depiction of our sources of revenue, so we are more than half from property tax and our local control funding formula sources. And then we receive very small amounts in the other areas. And this is our expenditures. So in our budget, about 19% or so from 17-18 was certificated salaries. About 23% or so were for classified salaries. And then you can see employee benefits, about 20%. So the largest portion of our budget, as is true for most educational agencies, is personnel. Makes sense. We're a service organization. We depend on each other to deliver the services. And actually, compared to other organizations, our percent isn't extremely high or out of whack. There are some organizations where that percentage total would be 80 to 90% of their budget. And one of the things we're keeping in mind as we work on our budget development process is a calculation called the indirect rate. If any of you have a grant in your program, if you operate a separate program budget, you often will see an indirect rate percent that's charged to your budget. We also charge that indirect rate for all the services that we provide to our districts and other partners. As we make changes and as we've had declining enrollment in all of our student services programs, it has triggered our indirect rate to increase. This creates a vicious cycle. The more the indirect rate goes up, the more our student serving programs are charged against their project, which means they have to make cuts, which means the indirect rate goes up. And so you create this vicious cycle. So we've decided to have that awareness be a part of the conversation as we're making decisions, and that we can't take all the reductions in those places that are student services. We need to be able to also look at all of the supports that are in place to operate those programs and make sure that there's balance and awareness. And so part of our decision making is going to include always keeping in mind when we see a change or an opportunity for a reduction, what is the impact on the indirect rate, and does it get us where we need to be? So what we wanted to do next is take some time to engage with you as stakeholders into some small group activities. We're going to have 2 activities this evening. The first activity is a priorities activity. We're going to divide and ask all of our stakeholders to organize into 4 groups. And we have some of our directors from our office who are going to be facilitating the small group conversations. And I want to extend an extra special gratitude to all of the directors who were willing to step in and be facilitators, for taking the extra time to meet with me earlier today to prep for tonight, and for being here this evening. So what we'll do is first I'll ask the directors who are going to facilitate to go to the different stations. We'll just do 4, so we'll have one over here, one here, and one over here. And then that one, they're a little bit close, so we can do 2 on that side, but maybe kind of organize our chairs more. And then if we could ask all of our stakeholders in just a few minutes after I give directions to go to one of the 4 areas in such a way that we have a manageable size of people at the group. So I'm not going to assign you or ask you to count off numbers or anything like that. I'll just trust you to balance out the size of the groups so that every stakeholder has an opportunity to have voice this evening. So our first activity is called Living Our Values Every Day, Our Top 10 Priorities. What we'll do is give you a list of some of the programs and services that we provide that are dependent on external revenue to help them operate. We'll give you a chance to look at that list, also consider maybe additions or changes to the list. And then you'll have an opportunity to have discussion with your facilitators. And then you'll engage in a dot activity where you place dots on the priorities chart to help us understand the priorities that you as stakeholders might have. And I want to give one word of caution. Just because an item may not end up with any dots does not mean that we would be cutting that program or eliminating that service. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is to help us understand how we're going to prioritize our investment and maintain quality. It's not necessarily that we would be eliminating programs or positions based on the priorities. What it might also do is help us think about other ways of funding some of the things that maybe are not as high priority. So there's lots of ways for us to use your feedback, and so I don't want to scare anyone and make you think that you need to spread your dots out to save your friend. So once the individual, you have the opportunity to look at them individually, then you'll put your dots, and then your facilitators will do a little closure. Then at the end of that 30-minute time block, we'll transition and I'll give some directions for the second activity. One of the things I want to share before we break into groups is that we didn't put in on the schedule any set time for a break. So feel free, as you're comfortable, to help yourself to water and coffee, and also restroom facilities are right around the corner. So we'll start our 30 minutes now, and please find a station. Feel free to take your chair with you if you prefer to sit, and find a comfortable group to join. So we're going to give a 5-minute warning. If you could wrap up your activities in 5 minutes.
Biased by where they're coming from, their programs. You can't help but think it's correlated to their personal funding.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
That's what I said too. So it may not be, it is, again, PBIS is a form of a multi-tier, but NTIA says it's.
How's it going? Okay, if everyone would please maybe come back to your seat or a seat. I want to introduce our second activity. if everyone could help out, if you are engaged in conversation, help your colleague redirect and come back to attention for the whole group. So thank you all for your engagement in the small groups. It was really heartening to hear the thoughtful questions you were asking and the clarifications that you were receiving. So I want to introduce our second activity. After I introduce, we'll ask you to go ahead and go back to a small group setting. But I also encourage you to consider mixing up your groups. Sometimes we get, as part of the design thinking process, more brainstorming and more creativity if we can mix around and engage with new people. So for our second activity, we're calling recommendations. We're going to ask you to dig a little bit deeper and to think about the organization overall. So here we've spent some time thinking about very specific programs with very specific funding sources. And next, we want to think about the County Office of Education overall. So we're going to take the first 20 minutes and ask you to discuss two open-ended questions. The first one is, what recommendations do you have for revenue generation, cost savings, or other efficiencies? So this is a place where, for example, if you're an employee of the county office and you deal routinely with a particular process that you think is inefficient, maybe costs us too much money to do it in the way we're doing it, this would be a place where you could bring up those ideas. Or if you know other opportunities where we can generate funding or places where we could charge a fee for something we do, this would be the place to answer that question. And the whole office wide is up for conversation on that item. The second question is, what would you like the County Office of Education to think about or study related to cost savings, organizational structure, and/or efficiencies? So as an example here, we've had some of our district superintendents say, we'd really like you to do an in-depth study of indirect rate because we only charge 6% at our district level. It's single digit and yours is double digit. Why is that? We want you to do a study and help us understand. It could be about programs. It could be about services. It could be about processes, organizational structure, or any other efficiencies. And so there are some resources that are at your table that might help facilitate that conversation, but it's really meant to be open-ended. We want to hear from each stakeholder. And then we'll take the last 10 minutes of this activity to allow the directors who are facilitating the small groups to share out one or two of the ideas that emerged in your conversation. We are going to collect all of the feedback and organize it in a way to share back out with all stakeholders, but we thought it would be really helpful for you to hear what some of your colleagues are thinking about. So for the next 20 minutes, you'll engage in the conversation on the two questions, and then I'll call time and ask for the directors to be ready to share a couple of things from your groups. All right, thank you. So directors should go back where they were, but we encourage participants to move around a bit. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear and you've had at least some time to talk about some ideas. And what we'd like to do now is go around to each of the groups and ask you to share out one or two of the topic areas or ideas that came up. And our only request is that if one group mentions something that you also talked about, just to not repeat it, just to go ahead and give us a new item from your list. And Chief Gordillo is going to help by bringing the microphone around. And which group would like to go first? Okay, we'll go back to Damaris.
Thank you. So the first item that came up in our discussion was the redundancy or overlap in work and responsibilities, being able to resolve that by becoming more aware of what each other do and not working in silos, which is perceived as a waste of human capital and time in many instances. And then strengthen what is working through increased collaboration.
Okay, Jonathan.
Okay, sorry, we were, am I only allowed to say one for each?
Or two, yeah.
Okay. We were thinking about doing fundraisers like some school districts do, whether at the cluster level or just as a whole. Also maybe tap into some of our tech giants, ask them for grants. There's a lot of money, a lot of billionaires here. Also came up is when we establish new policies, we should evaluate it against the budget. Is this policy going to increase or decrease our budget? Palace is costing some of us more money than saving money.
And for the audience members who might not know, Palace is our purchasing program for supplies at the school sites.
That would be all of us, I think. It's costing all of us more.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
And can't read my writing on this one, so I'm going to pass the mic.
Well, we'll come back to you. Okay, another group? Okay, Phil?
Okay, so the instructions were just a couple this time, is that
Yes,
the
a
deal?
couple, ideally from question A, and then we'll come back around.
Okay, so one big one, I'm going to go to number 2 here, is eliminate paper and work process. And that was a really comprehensive one. There were lots of places we could do that. And eliminate paper is just the tip of the iceberg. It's making all those processes, examining them, putting forms in that can be populated automatically where it makes sense. So automating as much as possible of that. Then we also talked about a whole bunch of stuff, but renting out facilities where possible and appropriate. And I say appropriate because we want to keep offering facilities free to people who should have them that way. So.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'm supposed to give a shout out to the Deaf and Hard of Hearing program. Right, so.
Excellent, thank you. Another, okay, Rebecca?
All right, we talked about our curriculum and instruction department, the workshops and trainings that they provide. Their fees had drastically come down over the last couple years, so we're talking about raising the fees. But with that, also ensuring that when we're providing supports and trainings, we're being purposeful in regards to what we're providing. And we're actually helping the districts build capacity so that we then, in turn, allow them to, the money goes back to them. So we're giving them more of a package versus just a one-time, one-shot type of training. The other thing we're talking about is marketing, supporting in-house projects, professional development, and we know, Peter and his team does a great job doing that too. Searching for more grants, other funding opportunities. I know a lot of the county agencies that we work with throughout Santa Clara County, how do we leverage some of the work and funding that they provide out to our school districts, because they do a lot of work with school districts. So how do we do that? And then creating more partnerships with industries. Sandy talked a lot about how And I know even Microsoft has done a lot of work with us in providing some conference space and even paying for lunch and meeting space and so forth.
Very good, thank you. Another group over here? Oscar? Sonia?
Hi. Hi, everyone. One of the main things we talked about was looking at the cafeteria contract. It's been really expensive setting up trainings here in this facility. And the second thing we talked about was just making managers shoulder the budget, so really being responsible or paying attention to overtime, overage, and waste within their own programs.
We're doing number 2 later, right?
Yes, we'll do number 2 next.
Okay.
After. Thank you. Okay, Bobby?
Some of the things that we talked about, one of the things was tough love with the districts. Coming up with some kind of tiered system to work with the districts, because in some of our programs, we still only charge the district really low levels. Say like we charge $7,000, where other county programs for the same program, they're paying $33,000. So
You mean at other county offices?
so let's talk AED, right? For
I
slots.
thought that might be the example you were,
Right.
you were
For
thinking
slots,
of.
we're
Yeah.
charging really, really low levels, right? Where when you look at the other county offices for the same programs, they're charging $33,000, $35,000 per slot, where we're in single-digit thousands for our slots. So we need to come up with, you talk about building revenue, that cost, we need to bring that cost up somehow, maybe tough love in the tier system somehow to get those costs to today's cost, where they're at today's cost, we are nowhere near today's cost. The second thing is, one of our big sticklers is the indirect costs and direct costs of processing mileage is just insane. Mileage has never been right here, and every day somebody at COE has a problem with mileage and the processing of mileage. And so I just look at the direct costs of going back and forth just to get mileage right, right? So those are some of the things that we talked about fixing. And then, I hate to say it, but letting our administration understand revenue-driven soft costs to determine PDs and costs within the COE. Because if we want to do a PD and it's a revenue-driven part of the county office, maybe there's somewhere outside that the cost may be a little lower, right? So having our managers understand what the difference is between our revenue-driven departments and our soft cost departments might help them budget PDs better and bring those costs down. So once again, I guess we're buying into the indirect and direct costs. And I think the biggest part of that is mileage.
Great, thank you, Bobby. Thanks, Bobby. Okay, I think every group had a chance to share on question 1, so we'll go back around one more time for an item or 2 on question 2.
All right.
Yi?
Yes. So in our group, we talked about having the PBIS, continuous investment in the PBIS and also the MTSS, because we realize the resources that we have in educational services branch. And when we share these resources, special education and early learning also think that we can tap into the resources in-house. Another idea that we talk about is you know how at the leadership team meeting have different departments to present and their work, so then we can leverage the opportunity to collaborate more and streamline services. All right?
Yeah, excellent. Okay, another?
Rebecca, you want to go next?
Okay, everybody talked a lot about the approval process, and we just talked about possibly streamlining, understanding the impact of changing demographics, and then the LMC, just remembering and understanding that it really supports parents, preschoolers, teachers, SCOE employees, and all districts.
And for the audience who might not know, the LMC is the
Sorry.
Library and Media Center that we operate here at the office.
Okay, for the second question, we thought about perhaps studying cost savings and best practices used by other COEs, right? So having access to that information. And also considering Lean Six Sigma basics to evaluate and reduce waste in our organization, bring some of that engineering talk in here for that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I actually pulled a couple of these over here that kind of belong in this question too. Joanne suggested we could commission an efficiency audit. I wanted to give you credit for it. We had a category that I'm calling study workforce demographics, where we would look at sort of what our retirement population is or close to, and see what we could do to encourage some people to pursue later life opportunities earlier.
Can I go
And possibly some things with flex schedules or optional reduced time, working for optional reduced pay, if it fit with the type of job you were doing. So things that would fit in that category, that would deserve some serious study to get there, but might, yeah. So.
And I'd like to add, just on behalf of the special education, specifically deaf education, that I think some research and some analysis in terms of programs that we have that serve low incidence disabilities really needs to be done, not just here, but statewide. We've got some new reforms coming down from CDE for deaf, hard of hearing that we haven't been trained on or we're not prepared for. That was just implemented in January. And we have a lot of, not necessarily from county, but a lot of lawsuits going on in the state of California for deaf education because we are not able to meet their needs. So I think a lot of that comes down back to how we are either understanding what the needs are for this population and also just training, like having the deaf ed program really do that outreach to the teachers they work with, to the programs and population that we serve, so that I know we're rare, you know, deaf ed is rare, but so that we're not slipping up with services, and then those lawsuits cost us a lot of money. And in the end, you know, when we already know that we don't have the resources or the people to meet the needs of this particular population, we already know that we're going to lose because we know that we don't have what it takes. So I think some study needs to be done with that and addressing, and maybe, you know, a little bit more training or just like basic knowledge of what that is. Because a lot of times teachers don't even know, you know, the first thing about hearing loss. And although it's like a low incidence, we have probably about 500 kids in the county that have hearing loss, that the equipment and things like that are there's a lot of expenses that go into that, and a lot more when we don't actually provide the services and the supports that they need. So even though it's low incidence, again, it's a huge impact to the budget when that comes back on us for not providing what these students need.
Yeah, thank you for that. One endorsement I would give is that really the county office is uniquely designed and positioned to serve those underrepresented or very small populations of high-need students, whether it's through Head Start or through our special education programs. And that's part of the efficiency we can provide for our county, because individual school districts may not be in the position to really do a high-quality job if they're looking at one or two students who might need something versus countywide where we're looking at a larger number. So that really resonates well with our purpose and mission. Others? Bobby?
I just want to say, yeah, and I think the VIs, if they were here, they would be the same thing for VI. Same exact thing. They would echo the same thing to VI.
Okay, thank you.
Same thing for our students with behavioral issues.
Mm-hmm.
Autism in particular. There's a lot of fires that are putting out in individual situations through legal processes, which add, and then in the end, the services end up being
That's right, thank you. Anyone else that has another item for question 2? Rosalie, did you?
I was just wanting to ask regarding the vision, the behavior, the hearing, is the shortfall of funds just a chronic thing because the federal government and the state do not fund adequately special education? Is that just the crux?
It is. Rosalie, that's a big part of the equation. One is that we are so underfunded just in the base that I mentioned earlier and our ranking. And when you recognize that all students with disabilities are really general education students who need additional programs, services, and supports, so we're actually harming the, in 2 ways, and if you want to think about it that way, that the base for per pupil funding is low, and then we also haven't really addressed special education funding in our state in over 10 years. So there really haven't been any increases or changes to the formula. So the inadequacy of funding is certainly a big dilemma.
State and federal.
Yeah, state and in our state, about 60% of the cost to provide programs and services for students with disabilities comes from district funding at the district level.
Just to add on to that, when you add in the cost of living here, so the cost to educate any child in this county is going to be higher than many other parts of the state and federal government.
Yeah, that's true. Any other responses to question 2 that you would like to share? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to wrap up this part of the agenda and just share a little bit about what our next steps will be. And I wanted to share a little personal anecdote. This is my 5th year of living in California, and I moved here because I really don't like winter. So I wanted to share a little. So just indulge me for a moment and enjoy winter. I've done this. So a little reality. Certainly a good motivation to move to the Bay Area, where it's quite a bit more hospitable. But also just a great reminder that before we go taking that snow off the car or digging a hole, let's make sure we have the right information and we have good information. So we clear off the right car, and it's also nice to help your neighbor, I guess. Somebody's going to benefit from that. So part of our closure is just to talk about some of our next steps. This was just one of the opportunities we wanted to provide this year to help us with that budget conversation and make sure we have good data and good information. You might know that in the employee satisfaction survey that we did in January, we included a budget question. And we asked a question similar to what we talked about tonight, which was what ideas might you have and things you'd like us to consider as we're grappling with being a flat-funded organization. We also are currently in the throes of district and community stakeholder survey, where we'll also gain information from our districts and some of our community partners. The timeline is that layoff notices, I'm sure that's top of mind for many of you, layoff notices for certificated staff are required by law to be provided in March the 15th. And so we're in conversation now with ACE about what our program size is looking like it needs to be, what's happening with our special education program, with AED, and with OIA, and student enrollment drives those programs, as you likely know. We're also looking to see how we might mitigate the impact of layoffs by finding places where we have positions that are unfilled. So to the extent that we can manage reductions based on attrition and vacancies, that's our #1 priority. We're trying not to impact existing employees if we can avoid it. The other part I want to mention about that conversation, and it's a difficult conversation, is that we can't take all of the cuts in our office if we need to make cuts. We can't take them all in the student serving programs or with the teachers and paraprofessionals, because there are also administrators who support our programs across the organization. So we have to look at how we're going to be organized and supported and make sure there's good balance there. That also is related to that indirect rate conversation I mentioned earlier. So we're going to continue. Cabinet meets weekly, reviewing our budgets, our programs. We're talking about quality and priorities. We're looking at data and feedback that we're receiving. We'll be compiling what we learned tonight along with what's in the employee satisfaction survey. And we've also provided this information online, so some of our stakeholders are providing us feedback in alternate ways. We'll combine all that, put out a summary report about what we learned and what we used as part of our budget development. In April, we will have that ongoing work completed. And in May, the final preliminary program budgets will be due from our staff. We will also hold another budget study committee meeting and hope to know what the governor's revisions to the budget will be, and that will also help drive some of our final decision making. So we may do some mid to worst case scenario planning over the course of the next couple of months, realizing that if the budget is better than we hoped, that we may be able to pull back on some of those decisions. And then the budget will go to the board in June for hearing and then adoption. Just a couple other philosophical things as we approach this work that I wanted to provide you some assurance about. One of those is that we are very sincere in our conversations around aligning our priorities to the values and making our budget decisions help support that. We're also very committed to using the stakeholder feedback to help guide our decisions. And we hope that you'll see that reflected in the end product of what we bring forward. And then lastly, I think that quality is really of importance to us. And so if we can't do things well, we need to think about if we should do them. Megan likes to tell us we can do anything we want to do. We just can't do everything we want to do. And so part of that is going to help us think about some of the priorities and investments. So I want to thank all of you for being here tonight and know that priority investment for us is in our human capital, it's in our people, and we want to preserve as much of that as we possibly can. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.